Yanis Varoufakis has just revealed the dark truth behind the collapse of capitalism. Let's listen carefully, and I'll explain what it really means for us today.
The petty bourgeois.
Yeah.
The petty bourgeois who was squashed by the crisis of the 1920s in Italy and then late 1920s and early 1930s in Germany. Fascism is a petty bourgeois phenomenon. It begins not from the working class, it starts from the petty bourgeoisie and then spreads to the working class once the crisis of capitalism begins to deplete industrial workers' jobs. Exactly the same happened after our generation's 1929, which I keep saying happened in 2008. Except that after 2008, the process of immiseration of the petty bourgeoisie and the working class was worse than it was in the 1920s and 30s.
Here he makes a chilling comparison. The rise of fascism in the 1920s wasn't led by workers, but by the collapse of the middle class. And he's warning that after 2008, history began to repeat itself.
So the dark deal between Washington, D.C. and the Chinese Communist Party was, okay, we will send you over our machinery, our industry. You will produce the stuff. We will keep the IP, the intellectual property rights, in the case of Apple. So we will get a large share of the monopoly profits from selling iPhones, but you will keep the share, you'll keep the surplus value that you extract from your Chinese proletariat.
This is what Varoufakis calls the dark deal. America shipped its factories overseas, China provided cheap labor, and both elites got richer, but the ones who paid the price, ordinary workers.
The dominance of the dollar is fantastic for Americans and rentiers, and for Chinese capitalists, and Japanese capitalists, and German capitalists. And the people who actually suffer the most as a result of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar is the American working class, which was serially abandoned by the Democratic Party. And politics hates a vacuum. Donald Trump waltzed in and took it.
And this is the key. The so-called dollar dominance didn't help the average American. It hollowed out the working class, leaving space for Trump to rise in 2016.
Same for France, to a slightly lesser extent. And yet there aren't major movements in either country to leave the euro. I find it extraordinary. Now, I know there's huge downsides to leaving the euro. It'd be very painful. But the fact that's not even in the conversation in both nations is perplexing for me.
It was in the conversation, but it was killed off. Let me explain what the lure of the euro was for progressive people who were not sellouts, turncoats. Because the turncoats, we know why they wanted the euro. I have this memory of the 1970s when Greek trade unions would go on strike to gain some pay rise. Strikes are always extremely painful. There's a lot of sacrifice. Usually the strikers are never compensated. It's the strike breakers who get compensated because they get the pay rise even though they have not suffered any of the costs of the strike. And the next day, or 5 days after securing a 5%, let's say, wage increase, the Bank of Greece would devalue the drachma and they would lose it all. So the notion of a currency that cannot be devalued was very attractive even to trades unions. What they did not factor in was that there was a price to pay for that. And the price was that there would be internal devaluation. That they would, not find one morning that their currency, the money they had in their wallet, was devalued as a result of an action of the Bank of Greece. But, they would never get a pay rise. Indeed, they would get pay cuts. Don't forget that average wages today in Greece are 35% lower.
He's also brutal about the euro. For countries like Greece and Italy, joining the eurozone was like walking into a house on fire with no exits. Wages fell, pensions collapsed, and an entire generation fled abroad.
Who dares speak their name in parliament gets absolutely vilified and demonized. So, you have a dictatorship of those oligarchs who are... come to Athens, I'll take you to the northern suburbs. You see the Lamborghinis and the Porsches and the Ferraris.
Well, I'll hold you to that, Yanis.
Yeah.
You can show me.
It's a very ugly scene.
Okay, so what I would say, I'm not suggesting for one moment that the German working class get a better deal out of it, but what I would say is there is a fragment of Italian or French capital who gets a really bum deal out of this, industrial capital, which comparatively speaking was getting a better deal 25 years ago.
That's why they were giving a lot of money from the coronavirus recovery fund to keep them sweet, and they've kept them sweet. They gave them something like 130 billion to keep them happy.
Let's talk about COVID, because this is interesting, right?
Because the pandemic was a major, major boon. It was, a manna from heaven for the establishment. Manna from heaven. I'm not talking about vaccines and all that, right? I'm talking about an opportunity to take on a lot more debt, pile it up on the shoulders of the weaker, of the working classes, and distribute it amongst themselves. Only in Greece, in 18 months, during the pandemic, the right-wing government was allowed to borrow another 60 billion in a country where GDP is 190. That's a huge amount.
And when the pandemic hit, governments borrowed billions. But instead of protecting citizens, that money went straight to the oligarchs and corporations. For them, it was like winning the lottery.
Can you explain why all this money printing that's primarily going to the top 0.01% or whatever we want to say, why does that mean the end of capitalism and the transition to something else?
You see, it depends on how you define capitalism. Because different people, I have a Marxist definition of capitalism, but not everybody does. Some people think, the marketplace, buying and selling, not having the state telling you what to buy and how much to pay for it. That's capitalism. No, it's not. Capitalism is a system based on the private ownership of the essential means of production, and a system which is predicated on profit that comes out of surplus value, exploitation of labor, of wage labor, and markets. The whole point about the transition from feudalism to capitalism was that you had the process of commodification of land as a result of the enclosures, getting rid of the peasants, and commodification of labor. During feudalism, land and labor didn't have markets. Workers worked, but they couldn't quit, they didn't receive a wage, just that the feudal lord sent the sheriff over to collect rents from them. Okay? So markets and profits, the two pylons on which capitalism sits, both of them are now optional and actually a sideshow. Instead of profits, you have central bank money combined with cloud rents, the 40% of the price you pay on Amazon retained by Jeff Bezos. All the surpluses that private equity firms get. Remember, 3 companies, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, own 90%.
This is his most shocking point. Capitalism is already dead. What we have now is something darker. Technofeudalism, where Amazon, BlackRock, and Vanguard act like feudal lords, extracting rents instead of profits. So, do you agree with Varoufakis? Is capitalism really dead, or is it just transforming? Let me know in the comments and subscribe if you want to keep uncovering these hidden truths.